Hello, everybody. Welcome to the course. Today, we're going to be talking about high-order components in React. So what is a high-order component? Higher-order components, or HOCs as they're commonly called, is an advanced technique in React for reusing component logic. HOCs are not part of the React API per se. They are a pattern that emerges from React's compositional nature. Higher-order component is a function that takes a component and returns a new component. This is used to add things to a component or reduce redundant code. So let's look at an example here and see what that actually means in a real world application. So here we have let me refresh this. Here we have a application that I made, a really simple one where it has a button you can click and increase the size of the font, or you can hover over this other button and increase the size of the font. They're doing the same thing, but in different ways. So let's look at the code for these, and we'll see how similar they are. So here we have the click button. So we see here we have an on click, which then increases the size. The size is using state, starts at 10, and this function adds to that size every time you click the button. If you look at the hover component, we see it's also got to use state, starts at 10, except on mouse over, it increases the size. So they are effectively very similar. The only difference is one has an on mouse over, one has a on click over, and there's a few variations in the text. So this obviously violates the DRY principle, which is don't repeat yourself. A lot of this code is repeated and not being reused. We're not reusing the same function or anything where you are writing a whole new function every single time. So how can we solve this problem? Well, that's where a higher order component comes in. So let's look a little bit into that. So we're going to start with a higher order component here. This is a higher order component. What it's doing is it's taking in a component, original component, and then it's putting it through a function. Here we have a new component, and we're passing in some props, and it's returning the original component. Now this obviously doesn't do anything. It just returns the original component, but we can use this structure to move that functionality into this component rather than having the repeated duplicated code in both components. So let's get into doing that. So first, we're going to import this higher order component. So let's do that. Let me just look here. If I export it as a default, I did. Okay. So we will call it with counter, for example. And what you do with this is you pass this component, which we create here as this function. So we have this functional component. We pass it directly in to this function. Now, once again, this won't do anything because we aren't changing it, but we are adding a higher order component in place. So if we were to look at the code, we will see, let's refresh it. We see that it still does everything it was doing before, nothing broke. It's just being passed through a new component. Now, if we go in here, we're going to do the same thing. I'll just copy and paste this to save a little bit of time. So we're going to insert with counter, and we're going to put it here and put that component inside of it. So we're going to use props to pass data down to the higher order component. So let's look at this. So we're going to go into the higher order component, and we're going to get out of props. We're going to pass some data down. We can say name, right? We're just going to put this in here. And now we can pass that into one of these other components, such as, let's go in the hover case, and we can pass this name prop, which is now in the props of the hover increase. So for example, we want to say increase on hover. We could say value of, well, let's just put in something here. We could say value of name. What is the value of name? Right, we'll just pass that to the front end. We'll say value of name is props.name. So let's see what that looks like on the front end. Or not the front end, but the actual code. So we got value of name as test. So we pass that in there. All right, so now how can we use these props to actually do something we're trying to do, like actually encapsulate this logic so we don't have to repeat it multiple times? So let's look at how we can do this. So we're going to go back into our higher order component. And now we need to get some data, right? And we need to pass it around. So the first thing that's duplicated, right? We have this counter in both of these. We have the counter here, right? So let's just copy it. And we have the counter and the click increase. So why do we need that twice, right? That's totally duplicated. So we can add it right here. And let's add in useState from React. All right, so we got our useState here. And so we've got, well, that is the font size, but in this case, it actually is a counter. So we're going to rename it to counter, and we'll call it set counter, because this is reusable, remember, so it may not always be a font size. You could pass other things into it and out of it. So let's take this counter, and let's just stick it inside of, we'll pass it down. So now we could say pass the counter down to original components, right? And then we also want to have an increment function, right? To make that counter increment. We don't need this name thing anymore. So we'll get rid of that. So we might want to say, let's pass, let me put this in parentheses so it doesn't break. All right, so let's pass a function down. So let's do increment, called increment counter. And then we're going to pass a function here, which does just that. So we need a function call, or not a function call, we need to create a function that will then get called when some event triggers, such as an on hover or an on click. So we're going to say set counter, and then we want to take the counter from above, right? And then we want to set it to itself +1, which you can do that a couple different ways, but you also got to spell it correctly or it won't work. All right, so there we go. So we got our counter. We're saying, okay, increment this counter. So it's going to be 10 + 1, which should be 11, right? And then it gets saved back in the state, which then updates in React and causes the whole page to re-render. So we got that in place, but now what do we need to do? We need to actually go back to our click increase and our hover increase and change those so they actually function as intended and implement this thing. So let's go to, just go to click increase. So now in props, we should have this data. Let's go back to hover. So we have a props in this hover. We'll start there. If we actually don't need this anymore, we'll delete that. We don't need this anymore. We'll delete that. So all we need is to do, we just need to pull these out of the props. So let's pull them out of the props. We'll destructure that. So we will say increment counter, and they'll pull them right out of the props. So now we have this data. Hopefully, yeah, there we go. Okay, increment counter. And the next step is we need to display this stuff on the screen, right? So we would say, so instead of the value, we'll get rid of this, and we'll say the size of the function of mouse over is now going to be counter, not font size. And then we need to say, let's see here, and then we need to also change this function. So it's actually going to call the increment counter function instead of this. So that will increment it every time. And then it's say increase on hover, right? So it hovers over, it increments it, and then to render the value, we have the counter coming out, and then we need to change this piece style, right? So it needs to be size, I think it's font size, and then it needs to be the value of counter. All right, let's see how that works. That should work. Let's just verify that. So we will get this going here. Okay, so we got an issue. Let's see here. Oh, I see. So we got one issue here was a typo, pretty common, hardest thing in programming is not making typos. All right, so you got the increment counter. So that's one typo there. So I made an error here. This needs to go inside of the new component here because that is a state in the new component. It doesn't register outside. So now we should be able to see this on the screen. So there it is. So it's still working there. Look at that. That's the hover. So let's now update the click, which is going to be the same thing. In fact, I'm just going to take this here because we're going to do the exact same thing on click. So we're going to replace this state with the props, the data we're getting passed in from the higher order component. And we're going to get our props here. And we're going to get rid of this because we're not using it. And then we have, instead of set font size, we have increment counter. And we're just going to remove the little function inside of here because we're doing that in the higher order component. And then instead of font size, we want to say, well, we would just say font size. And then we would say counter. And then this also needs to be the counter so we can see it. And there we go. So that should also work. Let's check it out. Make sure everything's loading. Okay. So that's working fine. This is working fine. Oh, except it's hover, not click. So there we go. Working fine, working fine. So now we got both of these components working without having to have that logic, that shared logic spread apart or duplicated throughout different applications now, or different components. Now, if you wanted to add 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 things that counted, this is super simple, but there are instances where you would actually want to have something like this and reuse on every page, or you reuse all over an application. So you could create 50 different versions of this that increments things, and all you do is call this function and it would increment. Like I said, this is a super simple example. You do use higher order components for much more complicated things like Redux, and there's a lot of stuff whenever you have a function where you pass your component into the function that is a higher order component. So it's a very common practice in React to see those all over the place. Hope that's helpful, and let me know if you have any questions, and we will walk through this and clear it all up for you. So thank you very much.